experience is purely with Prince Andrew. Obviously, we've got a lot of security procedures at the palace. Gates have to be locked, gates have to be secured. If we've stopped one of his guests because we have information of who they are.
A former armed royal protection officer has now broken his lifelong non-disclosure agreement, stepping forward with allegations about what he claims unfolded inside Royal Lodge.
Prince Andrew flew off the handle if we've not opened the gate for him in time. Just a really rude individual.
Behind the secured gates of the Duke of York's residence, he describes not merely a tabloid scandal, but troubling conduct, unchecked privilege, and an atmosphere of silence. Palace aides are reportedly angered. Legal representatives are said to be assessing options. Was discretion driven by loyalty, fear, or calculated preservation? Now, testimony and potential investigation converge, raising questions that may not fade quietly. The moment the gates stopped guarding, Royal Lodge was supposed to represent order. Tucked inside the vast grounds of Windsor, shielded by trees and layers of security, it stood as one of the most protected private residences in Britain. Armed officers were stationed at the gates.
Basically, we provide 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, armed protection.
Every visitor was logged, every vehicle checked. Protocol was not optional, it was the rule. Then one afternoon, that rule was tested. A young woman, no older than 22 or 23, approached the entrance. She appeared calm, almost casual. She told the officers she was there to see Prince Andrew. The timing was precise. He had arrived roughly half an hour earlier, so they knew he was inside. But the security procedure was clear. Without prior notice, without identification verified through internal channels, no one was allowed through. The officers tried contacting the residents. The footman did not answer. There was no response from upstairs, no confirmation, no clearance. They explained this politely to the young woman. They weren't accusing her of anything. They simply needed verification. It was standard, necessary, non-negotiable, or at least it was meant to be. She paused, then asked a simple question. "Shall I ring him on my mobile?" The officers exchanged glances. That alone was unusual. Still, they agreed. She dialed. The phone rang only briefly before it was answered. Even from a short distance away, the voice on the other end was clear and unmistakable. She was instructed to hand the phone to one of the officers. "Put an officer on the phone!" One of them stepped forward and took it. What followed was not a discussion about procedure. It was not a request for clarification. It was not even a demand delivered with restraint. It was, according to the former protection officer who later recounted this moment, a burst of fury, shouting, swearing, an insult aimed directly at the officer on duty. The tone was aggressive, humiliating, and explosive. The message was simple: let her in immediately. The young woman stood there. Her face reportedly flushed red with embarrassment as the outburst echoed loud enough for others to hear. The officer handed the phone back. There was no more debate, no further attempt to follow protocol. The gates opened. And something shifted that day, because this was not about celebrity impatience. It was not about a scheduling misunderstanding. It was about what happened after. According to the former officer, incidents like this changed behavior inside Royal Lodge. The unspoken understanding became clear. Questioning certain visitors, especially young women arriving without notice, simply was not worth the confrontation that would follow. Security adapted, not to protect the residents, but to avoid anger. That is the detail that lingers, not the raised voice, not an insult, but the quiet recalibration that followed. A supposedly secure royal property, guarded by trained professionals, began bending its own procedures to prevent explosive reactions from within. Fear does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a gate opening faster than it should. And inside Royal Lodge, that afternoon marked the moment when enforcement gave way to avoidance, and no one outside those gates knew it had happened. Fear rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in small, irreversible moments. Inside Royal Lodge, a gate opened too quickly, and authority quietly stepped aside. But was that hesitation mere protocol, or the first silent surrender no one beyond those walls recognized? Let's find out. The room where order meant obedience. If the tension at the gates hinted at something deeper, what waited inside the private rooms of Royal Lodge made that tension impossible to ignore. According to former protection officer Paul Page, who served in the Royalty Protection Command from 1998 to 2004.
So I was based with the Royal Protection Command from 1998 to 2004, and my role was to provide armed protection to the Queen.
There was one moment that stayed with him long after he left the palace. It was not a diplomatic meeting. It was not a high-level security threat. It was a bedroom. On one occasion, he entered Prince Andrew's private quarters. What he saw was striking, not because it was criminal, but because it was so strangely precise. Spread carefully across the bed were dozens of stuffed animals. Page estimated between 50 and 70 teddy bears arranged in exact positions.
On this particular occasion, went into Prince Andrew's bedroom, one of the bedroom cabinets, of a picture of these teddy bears, all in situ.
They were not scattered casually. They were positioned deliberately, almost ceremonially. This was not guesswork. There was a system. Inside a bedside drawer, Page says his inspector showed him a laminated card. It was not a simple note. It was a printed, protected diagram that displayed the precise placement of every single teddy bear on the bed. Each one had a designated position. Each one had to be returned exactly as shown in the photograph. The reason, he was told, was simple. If a maid cleaning the room moved one out of place and failed to restore it to its exact spot, the reaction would be immediate and explosive. Shouting, screaming, a full eruption over something as small as a misplaced toy. Staff learned quickly. Housekeeping was not instructed through gentle reminders. They were conditioned through fear of verbal outbursts. The laminated guide was not decorative. It was protective. It existed so that no one would make a mistake that might trigger another scene. It would be easy to dismiss this as eccentric behavior. Many powerful people have unusual habits, but this was not about personal quirks. It was about control. The room reflected something larger. Every object had a place. Every staff member had a role, and any deviation from expectation was met with anger rather than discussion. Inside Royal Lodge, employees understood boundaries without them being formally written. Complaints were pointless. Confrontation was unthinkable. The system adapted to the temperament of the man at its center. And this is where the earlier moment at the gates begins to make sense. The raised voice over the phone was not an isolated flare-up. It matched a pattern described by someone who had witnessed daily life behind those guarded walls. Years later, when Prince Andrew would sit down for his now infamous 2019 interview on BBC Newsnight and calmly deny serious allegations,
your old friend was, victims say, complicit in his behaviour.
If I was in a position to be able to answer all these questions,
projecting confidence and certainty, those who had seen these private moments recognized something familiar. The public saw composure. Some former staff saw the same rigid insistence on being right, the same refusal to yield, the same certainty that the rules did not apply in quite the same way. Inside that bedroom, with its rows of carefully aligned teddy bears,
Prince Andrew's bedroom and his apartments, and on his bed was 72 teddy bears on his bed.
And its laminated placement chart, the story was not about toys. It was about authority that could not be questioned. It was about a household that adjusted itself to avoid confrontation. And it was about how behavior, repeated often enough behind closed doors, can quietly shape an entire environment without anyone outside ever knowing what is happening within those walls. Inside that meticulously ordered bedroom, where teddy bears stood in disciplined rows beneath a laminated chart, the issue was never about toys, but unquestioned authority. How long can a household quietly reshape itself around unchallenged behavior before silence becomes complicity and control becomes culture? Keep watching. The interview that changed everything. The pattern described inside Royal Lodge did not remain behind closed doors forever. In November 2019, it moved into full public view. Prince Andrew sat down for a now infamous interview on Newsnight with journalist Emily Maitlis. The setting was calm. The lighting was steady. The tone, at least on the surface, was controlled. But what unfolded would become one of the most scrutinized television appearances in recent royal history. During the interview, Andrew addressed allegations made against him and firmly denied key claims. One statement in particular stunned viewers. He said he was physically unable to sweat at the time in question.
peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat or I didn't sweat at the time, and that was, oh, actually, yes, I didn't sweat at the time.
Explaining that he had developed a medical condition after experiencing what he described as an overdose of adrenaline during the Falklands War.
I had suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at.
Because of that, he claimed, it would have been almost impossible for him to sweat.
And I simply, it was almost impossible for me to sweat.
The assertion was meant to dismantle a specific allegation. If he could not sweat, then he could not have been the man described. The logic was simple, direct, definitive. But for those who had worked around him, it was something else entirely. Paul Page, who had served as an armed protection officer between 1998 and 2004, watched the broadcast with disbelief. He later said that during his time protecting members of the royal family, he had personally seen Andrew sweating.
I mean, the interview was absolute tosh. You know, I don't sweat. Well, I've seen him sweating in the back. I've said it.
One memory stood out clearly. It was a hot summer day. Andrew was playing golf. A police officer had been tasked with collecting golf balls as he practiced. Page remembered wiping sweat from his own brow in the heat. He also remembered seeing Andrew do the same. It was not dramatic. It was not a scandal. It was simply an observation. But it directly contradicted what had just been stated on national television. Page was not alone in his reaction. According to his account, other staff members who had worked within palace grounds were equally surprised. For them, the claim did not align with what they had witnessed during routine duties. Yet despite that, no one stepped forward publicly at the time. No major broadcaster invited Page to counter the statement. No official palace clarification addressed the discrepancy. The interview aired. The explanation circulated. The moment passed, and that silence mattered. By this point, three elements had aligned. There was the behavior at the gates, where protocol bent under pressure. There was the atmosphere inside the bedroom, where order was enforced through fear of outbursts. And now there was a public statement that former insiders believed did not match reality. Individually, each episode might be dismissed as minor. Together, they formed a pattern. A temperament that resisted challenge. A system that avoided confrontation. And when contradictions surfaced, an absence of institutional correction. The most striking part was not the claim about sweating itself. It was how quickly the contradiction dissolved into the background without serious internal dispute. The public debated it. Commentators analyzed it. But those who said they had first-hand knowledge remained largely unheard. Inside Royal Lodge, according to Page, fear shaped behavior. Outside, silence shaped perception. And in that gap between what was witnessed and what was broadcast, something larger than one interview began to take shape. What proved most unsettling was not the contradiction itself, but how effortlessly it faded, without meaningful challenge. If fear governed behavior inside Royal Lodge and silence managed perception outside, what truth was quietly reshaped in the space between witness and broadcast? Stay with us. When the story turned back on the source. After the 2019 Newsnight interview, attention briefly shifted toward the contradictions. For those who had served inside Royal Lodge, the sweating claim did not stand alone. It sat alongside years of behavior they said they had witnessed firsthand. But instead of confronting the substance of those claims, focus quickly turned to the man repeating them. Paul Page was not presented to the public as a former protection officer who had spent 6 years inside palace grounds from 1998 to 2004. He was introduced through his downfall. In 2009, Page was convicted of property fraud involving millions of pounds. He admitted that while serving as a royal protection officer, he had engaged in share dealing, initially making large profits before suffering heavy losses. The pressure mounted. He turned to fraud. He went to court. He was sentenced and served time in prison. That conviction became the headline attached to his name. Tabloids emphasized his criminal record. His credibility was questioned. The narrative became simple. A disgraced former officer with a prison history was making allegations against a senior royal. For many observers, that framing was enough to dismiss everything else he said. Yet something else was striking. While Page's character was dissected, the details he described about life inside Royal Lodge were not formally rebutted. There was no official statement denying the existence of dozens of teddy bears arranged on the bed. No clarification addressing the laminated placement diagram kept in a drawer. No public contradiction of the shouting incidents described by staff. And after the sweating claim aired on Newsnight, there was no institutional effort to correct or directly challenge the version of events offered by someone who said he had witnessed otherwise. Instead of refuting the message, the focus remained on the messenger. Inside Royal Lodge, according to Page's account, anger was not rare. He described Prince Andrew as verbally abusive towards staff, prone to shouting and swearing over relatively small matters. He said complaints were made, but no one was prepared to formally pursue them because Andrew was widely understood to be protected at the highest level. The atmosphere, he claimed, was one where challenging him carried consequences. Those claims were serious, but rather than being investigated publicly in detail, they were overshadowed by reminders of Page's criminal past. The effect was subtle, but powerful. If the source could be portrayed as flawed, the substance of his claims became easier to sideline. The attention shifted from what allegedly happened inside Royal Lodge to who was speaking about it. And yet the questions remained. The behavior at the gates, the strict, fear-driven order inside the bedroom, the temper described by those who had worked nearby, the contradiction that surfaced on national television. None of it was directly dismantled. It simply existed in a space where doubt about the speaker softened scrutiny of the subject. In that silence, the pattern continued to linger, unresolved and largely untouched. And yet the unease persisted. The incidents at the gates, the rigid control behind closed doors, the contradictions left unchallenged. When doubt shifts attention away from substance, what truths remain protected, and who ultimately benefits from silence? Stay glued. The manuscript that met resistance. By the time the focus shifted away from Paul Page's criminal conviction, a different figure had already begun examining the same world from another angle. This time, it was not a former protection officer speaking from memory. It was a historian working through documents, interviews, and years of research. Andrew Lowney spent 4 years investigating the lives and dealings of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. He approached roughly 3,000 people. Around 300 agreed to speak with him. Diplomats, naval officers, former associates. His work was not rushed. It was methodical. The result was a detailed book titled The Rise and Fall of the House of York.
Entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, which is available.
When it was released in the United Kingdom, it became a bestseller. Reviews described it as rigorous and deeply sourced. The material included financial dealings, personal relationships, and the broader environment surrounding Andrew's role within the monarchy. It painted a picture not of isolated incidents, but of a long pattern of conduct and influence. The success caught international attention. In the United States, Simon & Schuster's Gallery Books imprint secured the rights in a deal reportedly worth $250,000. Early editorial feedback suggested the manuscript was solid. It required refinement and structural adjustments, but the substance was considered present and publishable. Then something changed. Weeks before publication, the American contract was abruptly canceled. The promised 90-day revision period outlined in Lowney's agreement was not fully granted. The manuscript was declared unacceptable. The deal was terminated. For Lowney, the decision did more than delay a book. It effectively blocked his entry into the American market. He has since pursued damages in the hundreds of thousands, arguing that the withdrawal caused significant financial harm. According to Lowney, the resistance extended beyond publishing logistics. He said his publishers received legal letters warning that the content was being monitored. He claimed he was told his social media activity would be observed. He described repeated difficulties accessing archival material related to Andrew and Ferguson.
Andrew, that the Met and the National Crime Agency, and indeed HMRC, should be investigating him and Sarah Ferguson, even a greater case for that to happen.
Requests were denied on grounds of security or unavailability. Interviews became harder to secure. Doors that had once opened slowly began closing. He also said that when he approached Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson at the beginning of his research, they declined to cooperate. Ferguson, he stated, went further and advised friends not to engage with him. None of this, on its own, proves wrongdoing, but it reinforces a familiar pattern. A detailed investigation gathers momentum, documentation accumulates, then obstacles emerge, legal pressure, publishing reversals, restricted access. The earlier chapters described what allegedly happened inside Royal Lodge: the temper, the fear, the refusal to tolerate challenges. Loney's experience suggested something similar might be happening beyond those walls. Not shouting this time, but resistance. Not raised voices, but closed channels. Different messengers, same friction. And once again, the substance of the material did not disappear. It remained on record in the United Kingdom. But the expansion of that record into a wider audience met a barrier that few observers could ignore. Earlier accounts pointed to temper and tension within Royal Lodge, while outside its walls, resistance appeared quieter but no less deliberate. Different methods, familiar friction. If the record still stands in the United Kingdom, why does its wider reach encounter such persistent obstruction? Stay tuned. The warnings that would not go away. If the resistance faced by Andrew Loney suggested pressure behind the scenes, the next voice to enter the conversation brought even sharper language. This was not a former guard, not a historian navigating archives. It was an investigative biographer known for confronting powerful figures directly. Tom Bower had built a career examining the reputations of public figures others preferred to leave untouched. When he turned his attention to Prince Andrew, his tone was uncompromising.
There's so little sympathy for, not only for Andrew, but also for the whole way the royal family has handled, over the last 6 years, the Andrew problem.
He described Andrew as a professional con man, arguing that the Duke's public statements were not clumsy missteps, but calculated acts of deception. Bower focused heavily on the 2019 Newsnight interview. He suggested that Andrew entered that televised exchange prepared to mislead. According to Bower, the explanations offered regarding his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and Virginia Giuffre were rehearsed, deliberate, and knowingly false. He described watching Andrew's expression during the interview and seeing not confusion, but composure, not panic, but control. One line in particular captured public attention. During interviews and discussions about his research, Bower declared, "This is the chapter the palace hoped I would never write." The remark spread quickly across online commentary. Viewers speculated about whether there were sections of material too sensitive to publish, whether certain revelations had been softened, or whether more information remained withheld. There is no confirmed evidence of a secret manuscript locked away, but the statement resonated because it echoed a pattern already emerging. When stories about Andrew advanced too far, something seemed to intervene. Publishers hesitated, legal letters appeared, access narrowed. Then another perspective added depth to the discussion. Paul Burrell, who had served as butler to Princess Diana,
New royal book?
It is the royal butler, Paul Burrell.
What the Queen was really like, what Diana would make.
had long spoken about the culture within the royal household. While he was not Andrew's direct aide and did not claim to witness events inside Royal Lodge, his insight focused on structure rather than personality. Burrell consistently argued that the institution prioritizes its own preservation above individual accountability. He said the system protects itself first. He also shared that Diana had confided concerns about how the machinery of the palace operated. Decisions were often shaped by reputation management. Difficult matters were handled quietly. Problems were contained whenever possible. Placed alongside Page's account of temper inside Royal Lodge and Loney's struggle to publish internationally, Bower's warnings and Burrell's institutional observations widened the lens. The conversation was no longer confined to one man's behavior behind closed doors. It was about the framework surrounding him. Each voice came from a different world: a protection officer, a historian, a biographer, a former butler. They did not share careers or motives, yet they pointed toward a similar conclusion. When scrutiny approached too closely, resistance followed. The focus slowly shifted from isolated allegations to a larger question about how influence operates, how narratives are managed, and how difficult truths are delayed rather than directly confronted. What began at the gates of Royal Lodge now appeared to extend far beyond them, into the very structure that had long shielded those within its walls. As whispers at Royal Lodge grew louder, the question deepened. How far does influence reach, and how many truths are quietly delayed? hidden behind walls meant to protect, conceal, and shape the story the public will ultimately believe. Let's unravel the details. The shift in the shadows. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II's presence cast a protective shadow over Royal Lodge, a subtle but powerful influence that shaped what could be questioned, what could be challenged, and what was quietly tolerated. Staff knew that while the Queen was alive, certain behaviors, no matter how unusual, unsettling, or alarming, were unlikely to face scrutiny. It wasn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake, it was about the weight of authority, the unquestionable hierarchy, and the implicit understanding that the institution itself was always safeguarded first. Even when responsibilities shifted and duties were reassigned, the former Duke of York continued to reside at Royal Lodge, a constant presence whose actions remained largely insulated from accountability. That balance, however, did not last forever. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II marked more than a change of monarchy. It altered the protective dynamics that had long kept the Lodge's inner workings under a veil of control. Observers and insiders alike noted that King Charles III and Prince William, while carrying the burden of continuity, reportedly exercised far less hands-on protection. Where the Queen's influence had once created a subtle buffer for staff and institution alike, the mantle of oversight now seemed thinner, less immediate. The shift was not just symbolic, it had tangible consequences for how behavior at Royal Lodge was perceived, monitored, and crucially, acted upon. By February 2026, this fragile equilibrium shattered under the weight of formal investigation. Arrests were made, signaling that what had been tolerated or overlooked for years was now being scrutinized through the lens of law enforcement. National Crime Agency officers moved decisively, conducting seizures at both Royal Lodge and Wood Farm, confiscating devices that might contain evidence or records long thought untouchable. The presence of investigators, uniformed and procedural, yet deliberate and methodical, highlighted the scale of the shift. This was no longer speculation, rumor, or internal concern. The behavior once shielded by tradition and hierarchy was now being subjected to the rigor of formal inquiry. Through it all, the former Royal Guard's testimony gained an unexpected resonance. What had once seemed like mere observations, perhaps inconsequential stories told in hushed tones, now took on a different weight. He had not been disclosing scandalous secrets for the sake of shock or sensationalism. He had been describing behavior, patterns, temperament, and the unspoken rules that governed life inside Royal Lodge. That distinction, subtle but crucial, reframed the narrative. It was not gossip. It was evidence of how an environment operated under layers of influence, fear, and implicit protection. Investigators combed through the material with precision. Devices, records, and accounts were cross-referenced. Every detail, once dismissed or ignored, was now subjected to scrutiny, and while the former guard remained cautious, aware of the legal and personal ramifications of speaking out, his account had become a critical starting point for understanding what had long gone unquestioned. It was an extraordinary pivot. Decades of controlled behavior, institutional inertia, and silent compliance were finally meeting a system willing to examine the patterns rather than merely the headlines. The transition from protective authority to active investigation illuminated the fragility of assumed impunity. Where once a queen's presence had shielded certain individuals and behaviors from scrutiny, the absence of that influence exposed a different reality, one where accountability, however belated, was possible. And within this new landscape, every recollection, every detail remembered by staff or former guards, carried significance. Patterns that had been invisible under layers of deference now demanded attention, prompting questions that were long overdue. So what do you think was really happening behind Royal Lodge's closed gates? If staff were too afraid to speak, what else went unnoticed? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.